Touch that register again and I'll make sure this place is rubble by morning," Trevor Bishop hissed, sweeping a tray of dishes to the floor as Delia Hartwell pressed herself against the bar, 27 years old and shaking so hard she couldn't get a single word out. She was the kind of woman most people walked right past, the shy waitress at the Copper Thistle, who kept her eyes down and her voice soft, who worked 2 shifts just to chip away at her late grandmother's hospital bills and never once complained about it. Bishop's crew wanted protection money she didn't have, and when she whispered that there wasn't any cash in the drawer, they started smashing everything her family had built: mirrors, plates, the framed photos on the wall by table 7. So when one of them raised a hand toward her, Delia did the only thing her panicked body knew how to do. She bolted for the door and slammed straight into the chest of a stranger who'd just walked in, and his arms closed around her on pure reflex, steady as a wall. Nobody in that room knew who he was, this tall man in a tailored dark coat, maybe 37, with a calm, unhurried face and eyes that had gone very, very still. "Walk away and mind your business, pretty boy. This doesn't concern you," Bishop laughed, and the stranger said nothing at all, but something behind his gaze shifted, something cold and patient that had been sleeping for a long time and had just opened one eye, because Emerson Cade was the most feared mafia boss in Baltimore, and this shabby little restaurant these thugs were tearing apart wasn't some random target. He happened to own it, bought quietly years ago for a reason no one alive understood, and the frightened girl trembling in his arms had no idea she'd just fallen against the one man who could burn their whole world to the ground. Don't scroll away, because the secret buried in this quiet waitress's family, and the debt this silent king has waited most of his life to repay, is about to turn all of Baltimore's underworld upside down. If this opening pulled you in, do us a quick favor, tap that like button, share this story with someone who loves a tale of quiet strength, and subscribe so you never miss a story like this. Now let's step back and see how a shy waitress and a ruthless boss were bound together long before either of them ever knew it. In that moment, the entire room seemed to freeze, and Delia still had her face pressed against the chest of the strange man, feeling the oddly slow rhythm of his heartbeat, nothing like her own, which seemed ready to burst apart inside her. Emerson Cade didn't look down at the trembling young woman, nor did he look at the wreckage scattered around them. His gaze remained fixed for a long while on Trevor Bishop's face, a look without anger or threat, merely an observation, the kind a hunter gives to prey that doesn't yet realize it has already been marked. He gently rested a hand on Delia's shoulder, the gesture so light it was almost no touch at all, then slowly drew her away from him and guided her behind his back, shielding her with his own body without saying a word. Trevor Bishop gave a derisive laugh, the laugh of a man accustomed to hearing others beg, and stepped forward, still holding the napkin he had just snatched from table 7. His voice stretched with contempt as he said that this man appeared to be deaf, that this was business, not a place for people who fancied themselves heroes, and that he had better turn around and walk out the door while he was still able to leave on his own 2 feet. Emerson remained silent for another beat, and the weight of that silence became so oppressive that the 2 men standing behind Trevor began glancing at one another, sensing that something was wrong even though they couldn't put a name to it. Only then did he speak, his voice low, steady, almost gentle, entirely at odds with the violence that had filled the room moments before. He asked Trevor whether he knew who he was working for, whether he knew what name stood above the man who had sent him there. Trevor frowned, still trying to understand. When Emerson spoke a name, just one name, precise and final, like placing a chess piece upon a board, that name drained the arrogance from Trevor Bishop's face. He went visibly pale, the blood seeming to vanish from his cheeks in an instant, because it was a name no one in Baltimore's underworld dared speak, while the sun was still shining, a name known only to those who stood at the very highest reaches of power. For the next 19 seconds, Delia would count over and over in her mind for months whenever she remembered that afternoon. No one in the room moved. The only sound came from a remaining shard of broken mirror slipping from its frame and striking the floor with a faint, brittle clatter, while the late afternoon sunlight passed through the clouded window and illuminated the dust drifting in the air as though time itself had stopped. Trevor tried to preserve his composure. He laughed again, but this time the sound was dry and forced. He said the man had probably overheard a few names somewhere and was now using them to frighten people, but even he didn't believe his own words, and the hand gripping the napkin trembled slightly. Emerson took exactly 1 step forward, only one, and somehow that calm movement was more terrifying than any raised fist could have been. He told Trevor that he had 2 choices. He could leave immediately and carry a message back to the man who had sent him, Or he could stay and personally explain to the person Emerson had just named why he had laid hands on property that wasn't his. Then Emerson allowed those two choices to hang in the air without pressing him, without raising his voice. One of the two men swallowed hard, tugged at Trevor's sleeve, and whispered something into his ear. Dahlia saw hesitation appear for the first time on the face of the man who had been so overbearing only moments earlier. Trevor looked at Emerson once more, as though trying to make certain he hadn't misread something in those quiet eyes, then dropped the napkin onto the floor. Struggling to salvage the last scraps of his dignity, he jerked his chin toward Delia and said that the debtor was still there, that this wasn't over, that someone would return, and that next time no handsome stranger would make it through the door in time to interfere. He signaled to his men, and all of them slowly backed toward the entrance, bumping into an overturned chair along the way, though none of them bothered to set it upright. The glass door closed behind them with the delicate chime of the small wind bell hanging from its frame, a sound that had always seemed gentle but now rang like a warning that something had changed forever. Only when the last of them had disappeared beyond the window did Delia realize she had been holding her breath the entire time. She exhaled sharply, her legs gave way beneath her, and the strange man immediately caught her by the elbow, keeping her from falling with a gesture so quick and natural that it seemed he was accustomed to holding broken things upright just before they collapsed. She lifted her face to him and tried to offer her thanks, but the words caught in her throat. Emerson merely shook his head slightly, as though telling her not to speak yet. His gaze traveled slowly across the devastated room and came to rest on the old photograph lying face down on the floor beside table 7. For one fleeting second, too brief for Delia to grasp, something faint and deeply buried stirred within those still eyes, then vanished at once, leaving behind the same calm expression, as though nothing at all had happened. When the final chime of the wind bell had faded into silence, Delia stood motionless for a long while in the middle of the wrecked room, before bending down to pick up the old photograph lying face down beside table 7. Her hands were trembling so badly that she had to try twice before she could hold the frame securely. And when she turned it over, she saw that the glass had cracked diagonally across the face of her late grandmother, Pearl, the woman who had built this restaurant from nothing with her own 2 hands. Delia hurriedly wiped the corner of her eye with her sleeve, then began cleaning in silence, gathering each broken piece of china, setting the fallen chairs upright, and sweeping the glittering shards of mirror into one corner. All the while, the strange man didn't leave. Instead, he quietly bent down to help her, lifting the larger pieces with his steady hands and placing them neatly into the trash without saying a word, without showing pity, and without asking any unnecessary questions. And somehow that silence brought Delia more comfort than any words of consolation could have offered. When the room was finally somewhat orderly again, she straightened, clasped her hands tightly in front of her apron, and thanked him in the soft voice that came naturally to her. She said she didn't know what would have happened if he hadn't walked in at that exact moment, that she owed him something she didn't know how to repay, and Emerson merely answered that she didn't owe him anything, that sometimes a person simply happened to be in the right place at the right time. Delia invited him to sit down and told him to let her make him a cup of coffee as a small gesture of thanks. And although he gently declined with a slight shake of his head, she insisted with such awkward sincerity that he couldn't bring himself to refuse again. So he sat in the chair beside the window, the one position from which he could see the entire room, a habit Delia didn't notice, though anyone from his world would have recognized it immediately. She brought out a steaming cup of coffee and set it before him with a small sugar bowl. Her hand was still trembling, causing the cup to rattle softly against the saucer, and then she sat across from him, daring for the first time that afternoon to lift her eyes and look directly into the face of the man who had saved her, a face so strangely composed and unlike that of any customer who had ever stepped through this door. She asked his name, and he hesitated for half a second before answering that people called him Emerson. No surname, no occupation, only a solitary name, and Delia didn't press him because she understood better than most what it felt like not to want to tell a stranger about one's life. At that moment, Franklin Voss emerged from behind the door leading down to the kitchen, the restaurant's 52-year-old manager, with graying hair and the slow gait of a man who had witnessed too much in his lifetime. He had just heard that something had happened and hurried upstairs, but the instant his eyes fell upon the man seated beside the window, his entire body stopped for a beat, and the hand gripping the doorframe tightened until his knuckles turned white. Franklin said nothing, but a succession of emotions crossed his face that Delia, busy pouring more coffee, didn't notice. First came astonishment, then something very close to reverence, and finally, a slight lowering of his head, almost too subtle to see, the kind of bow one man gave to another who stood many ranks above him. Emerson caught the manager's gaze and raised one eyebrow ever so slightly, a silent warning for him to say nothing, and Franklin understood at once. He swallowed the words he had been about to speak, composed his expression, and stepped forward to ask whether Delia was all right. His voice tried to remain ordinary, but his eyes kept drifting toward the unfamiliar guest with an uneasiness he couldn't conceal. Delia briefly explained what had happened, telling him that the thugs had only left because this customer had intervened, and Franklin nodded, speaking words of gratitude while his mind was clearly reeling with something he couldn't share. He looked at Emerson once more as though needing to confirm that his eyes hadn't deceived him, that the man sitting here drinking coffee in this humble little restaurant truly was the person Franklin believed him to be. Emerson rose, placed several bills on the table, even though Delia had said the coffee was free, and told her he would return, his voice gentle, as though it were a casual promise, though there was nothing casual about it at all. Then he nodded farewell to Delia, gave Franklin one final, meaningful look, and stepped through the door, leaving behind a waitress bewildered by an unexpected act of kindness, and a manager standing frozen in place, his heart pounding beneath the weight of a secret he knew he must never reveal. That night, after locking the restaurant and saying goodbye to Franklin, Delia walked for more than 20 minutes through the cold streets of Baltimore's Harbor District before reaching her small apartment on the 3rd floor of an aging building, where the wooden stairs creaked beneath every step and the hallway light flickered as though it might go out for good at any moment. Her apartment consisted of only a single room, with an old heater that labored noisily and never gave enough warmth on the first nights of winter, walls where the paint peeled away in patches, and one narrow window facing the brick wall of the building next door. Yet she kept the place clean and orderly, because it was all she had left after Pearl died, and left her 2 things: a restaurant barely clinging to life, and a stack of medical bills so high that every time Delia looked at them, she felt as though she couldn't breathe. She sat on the edge of the bed and took an old tin box from the drawer, the one that held papers worn soft along the edges, then went through each debt one by one, each amount she could pay only a small portion of every month, while the balance continued gathering interest like a shadow that refused to leave her side. She calculated silently that even if she kept working 2 shifts this way, a morning shift at the restaurant and an evening shift, washing dishes at another diner several blocks away, it would still take her many more years to pay everything off. Delia had been orphaned when she was very young. Her parents died in an accident, and she could barely remember their faces. The person who raised her, taught her to read, showed her how to hold a knife and slice vegetables, and taught her how to smile at customers no matter how exhausted she felt inside was Pearl, the small woman with calloused hands and a heart so generous there was always room within it for the hungry and the lost. Delia remembered the mornings when Pearl rose before dawn to light the stove, remembered the smell of toasted bread filling the kitchen, remembered how she always paused beside every table and ran her palm slowly along the worn, polished edge of the wood. A strange habit Delia hadn't understood as a child until one day Pearl explained that she did it to feel whether the table was still sturdy, to know whether her home was still standing. She had told Delia that sometimes a person needed to touch something real, to remind herself that she was still here, still alive, and still had something worth protecting. And now, though Pearl was gone, Delia still kept that habit alive. Every morning when she opened the restaurant, the first thing she did was run her hand along the edge of table 7, Pearl's favorite table, the one beside the window where the old photograph now hung behind cracked glass. In that brief moment of touch, Delia could almost feel the warmth of Pearl's hand again, almost hear her voice whispering that no matter what happened, she must never bow her head before those with power and never allow fear to strip away her dignity. But that afternoon, when Trevor Bishop had pinned her against the bar and shards of mirror had exploded across the floor at her feet, Delia had been afraid. She had trembled. She hadn't been able to speak a single word. Now, sitting alone in the cold room, she felt ashamed of herself, as though she had betrayed the woman who had taught her to be strong. She wondered what Pearl would think if she could see her now, wondered whether she would be disappointed, and then her thoughts returned to the strange man named Emerson, to the way he had walked through the door and changed the entire room, to the stillness in his eyes that had made violent men step back. Delia couldn't understand why a stranger had chosen to help her, nor could she understand why that unexpected kindness filled her with gratitude and unease at the same time. She lay down and pulled the thin blanket up beneath her chin, listening to the wind slip through the cracks around the window and the distant cry of a ship's horn drifting in from the harbor. Before sleep finally claimed her, she had time for one last thought. Tomorrow she would still have to rise early. She would still open the restaurant. She would still run her hand along the edge of table 7 as she did every morning. Because it was the only way she knew to keep living. The only way to keep Pearl's last home from collapsing, even though the whole world beyond those walls seemed determined to tear it from her hands. Just as he had promised when he left, Emerson returned, and not only once. Every few days, he appeared again. Always in the middle of the afternoon when the restaurant was at its quietest, always taking the same chair beside the window, from which he could watch both the entire room and the street outside, and always ordering the same thing, a cup of black coffee without sugar, which he sipped so slowly that it seemed time was never something he felt compelled to hurry. Delia gradually grew accustomed to his presence. At first, she remained cautious, keeping the distance expected between a waitress and an unfamiliar customer, but with each visit, she began to realize that he wasn't like any man she had ever met. He spoke so little that he was almost silent. Yet when he did speak, every word seemed carefully weighed, neither too much nor too little, and he had a way of listening that made the person across from him feel that whatever they were saying truly mattered. She noticed that he was always observing. His eyes moved over every person who stepped through the door, pausing for half a second on their hands before rising to their faces. A habit she found strange but didn't dare ask about. And whenever a sudden loud noise came from the street, his entire body tightened for the briefest instant before relaxing again, so quickly that no one would have noticed unless they were paying close attention. Sometimes Delia caught him looking toward table 7, where the old photograph of Pearl now hung inside the new glass frame she had carefully replaced, and there was something in his eyes then that she couldn't understand, a distant sorrow mingled with something that looked very much like longing for a time long gone. Yet whenever she was about to ask, he turned away and shifted the conversation toward something unimportant, and the door that had opened only slightly between them closed again at once. She also began to recognize that two different men seemed to exist side by side within Emerson. One was calm, kind, capable of making her laugh with unexpectedly dry remarks about some of the more demanding customers, while the other was cold and unreachable, a man she occasionally glimpsed from the corner of her eye when he believed no one was watching. At those moments, his face hardened like stone, and his gaze became so sharp and dark that a chill moved down her spine, as though she had accidentally seen something she was never meant to witness. One afternoon, when she brought out his coffee and her sleeve slipped back by accident, revealing the fading bruise on her wrist from the night Trevor had shoved her against the bar, she saw Emerson's eyes change immediately. His gaze darkened, his jaw tightened, and for one brief moment she felt a wave of coldness radiate from him, a fury held under such perfect control that it seemed even more frightening than it would have been if he had allowed it to erupt. Then he drew a quiet breath, and when he looked up again, it had all disappeared, leaving only his familiar composure. He gently asked whether her wrist still hurt, and his voice was so soft that her heart began beating faster for no reason she could explain. Delia couldn't understand why she felt safe whenever he was there. A deeply contradictory feeling because every instinct warned her that this man carried something dangerous within him, that his calmness was like a smooth surface of water concealing a violent current underneath. And yet she still found herself waiting for the afternoons when he would return, still glancing toward the door whenever the wind bell chimed, and every time she saw him step inside, a warmth rose in her chest, something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in a very long time. Emerson, for his part, couldn't explain why he kept returning either. He told himself he came to make certain Trevor and his men didn't cause any more trouble, that he came because the restaurant mattered to him for reasons of his own, but deep inside, he knew that wasn't the whole truth. Each time he watched that small young woman carefully wipe every table and smile at every customer, even while her slender shoulders bent beneath the weight of her worries, something within his hardened heart stirred faintly, a feeling he had believed he had lost long ago. It left him both confused and wary, because in his world, tenderness was always the most dangerous luxury of all, something that, once exposed, would immediately become a weakness for his enemies to aim at. Not far from that little restaurant, on the highest floor of a gray stone building overlooking Baltimore Harbor, Emerson Cade stepped into a room entirely different from the modest world he had just left behind, a vast space with windows stretching from floor to ceiling, warm golden light falling across dark wooden bookshelves and a gleaming walnut desk, where everything carried the cold elegance of power accumulated over many years. Waiting for him inside were two people, the only two people in the world he truly trusted. The first was Otis Pruitt, a man in his 50s with a powerful build and the rigid posture of a former soldier, his face marked by the deep lines of time, and his eyes holding the quiet steadiness of someone who had witnessed too much death to know fear anymore, a man who had stood beside Emerson since the earliest days, and would have placed his own life between him and any danger without a second of hesitation. The second was Corinne Delacroix, a sharp and distant woman of about 34, always dressed in perfectly tailored suits, her hair pinned neatly into place without a single loose strand. Emerson's legal advisor and strategist, a woman whose mind was keen enough to uncover a weakness in any contract and turn the most complicated trouble into an advantageous move. Someone Emerson valued deeply for her intelligence, but around whom he never completely lowered his guard, because in his world, loyalty had always been the hardest thing to measure. Otis spoke first, reporting that all operations around the harbor were continuing normally, that their partners were honoring their commitments, and that there were no significant signs of unrest. But Emerson interrupted him with a slight movement of his hand. He sat in the chair behind his desk, laced his fingers together, and remained silent for a long moment before telling them what he had witnessed at the restaurant, how a gang of street thugs had openly entered to collect protection money and destroy property in territory that no one was supposed to touch without his permission. Corinne frowned slightly and said that it made no sense, that no one in Baltimore could be foolish enough to operate independently inside an area under Emerson's control without considering the consequences, unless some force stood behind them, a force powerful enough to challenge the order that had been firmly established for so many years. Emerson nodded, his gaze darkening, and there was now a coldness in his usually composed voice that seemed to lower the temperature of the entire room. He said that was exactly what troubled him, because those men hadn't simply come to collect money. The way they had targeted that particular restaurant, the deliberate manner in which they had destroyed everything, all of it suggested that this wasn't a random act of extortion but a message intended for someone, and he needed to know who had sent it and why. He ordered Otis to trace the leader, Trevor Bishop, to discover who he worked for and whose pockets received the protection money he collected, and to do it in absolute silence, without causing any disturbance and without revealing that Emerson had taken notice, because sometimes the best way to catch a snake was to let it crawl from its hole while believing no one was watching. He then turned to Corinne and instructed her to examine every unusual transaction that had recently taken place in the city, every suspicious movement of money, every new name rising through the underworld, anything that might reveal who was quietly expanding their influence and daring to cross into his territory. Corinne accepted the order with a decisive nod, but as she lowered her eyes to take notes, something faint passed through them that neither Emerson nor Otis noticed, the slightest flicker of hesitation, there for only an instant, before disappearing completely. Otis asked whether they should increase security around the restaurant, and Emerson fell silent for a moment, his gaze drifting unconsciously through the window toward the lights glittering along the harbor below. Then he answered that he would handle it himself, in his own way. A vague response that surprised Otis because he knew his employer had never personally concerned himself with an establishment so small, but Otis had learned long ago that some questions were better left unasked. So he merely nodded and remained silent. When the two of them departed, Emerson stayed behind alone in the vast room as twilight shadows gathered around him. He turned his chair toward the city, coming alive with lights below. And in that stillness, the image of the small young woman with frightened eyes and a bruise upon her wrist returned once more to his mind, leaving him to wonder whether his decision to protect that restaurant with his own hands was truly born only from old memories, or whether there was another reason, one he wasn't yet prepared to admit even to himself. It took Otis Pruitt less than 3 days to bring back the first pieces of information, and late one evening, after the city had sunk into darkness, he entered Emerson's office with a thin file tucked beneath his arm and a grave expression carved deeply into his already weathered face. He placed the file on the desk, opened it, and began laying out what he had uncovered. Trevor Bishop, the man who had led the gang of thugs that day, turned out to be nothing more than a minor link in the chain, a hired collector paid for each job, without the position or intelligence to devise a plan targeting Emerson's territory on his own. That only confirmed what Corinne had suspected from the beginning, that a far more powerful hand was pulling the strings from behind the curtain. Otis had traced the protection money collected by Bishop's men, and through several carefully arranged layers of intermediaries designed to conceal its true origin, every trail eventually led back to a single name, Hollis Renner, a rising crime boss who had spent the past several years quietly building his power in the western part of the city, a man known for being ruthless yet patient, always operating from the shadows and never appearing openly in any affair. Emerson listened in silence, one finger tapping lightly against the wooden desktop in a slow and steady rhythm, and when the name Hollis Renner was spoken, his eyes narrowed slightly, because he knew the man well. He knew Renner had long hungered to expand his territory, and had always watched Emerson's harbor district with the gaze of a starving man looking at a rich meal he hadn't yet gathered the courage to seize. What troubled Emerson wasn't that Renner had dared to collect protection money, but that he had chosen that particular restaurant, a small establishment worth almost nothing financially compared with the docks and warehouses under Emerson's control. He couldn't understand why. Among all the targets Renner could have chosen, he had selected that place to send his first challenge. Otis added that, according to what he had gathered, Bishop's men had made careful inquiries about the restaurant before acting. They knew it was a modest business, knew its former owner had died, and knew that only a young waitress remained to keep it alive. Every one of those details showed that this hadn't been a careless act of extortion, but a target deliberately chosen and studied, and that sense of purpose was what made it most disturbing. Emerson rose and walked to the glass wall, standing motionless as he looked out at the lights along the harbor. Inside his mind, the pieces began turning, though they still wouldn't fit together, because if Renner had only wanted to test Emerson's response, he could have chosen a larger target, one that would have drawn far more attention. Choosing a tiny restaurant in such a personal way gave Emerson the feeling that something deeper lay hidden beneath it, a motive he couldn't yet grasp. He wondered whether Renner knew about his connection to the restaurant, a connection Emerson had guarded carefully for years and never revealed to anyone except Franklin Voss. And if Renner truly knew, then there was a breach somewhere in the wall of silence Emerson had spent so long building, a leak he needed to find before it was too late. Corinne entered at that moment carrying the results of her own investigation, and she confirmed that Renner had recently made several unusual financial moves, including questionable investments in waterfront properties, as though he were preparing for a major expansion. But she also pointed out that there were several streams of money whose final destination she still couldn't trace. They disappeared through overseas accounts, hidden with extraordinary care. Emerson turned to her and asked whether she could continue following them, and Corinne gave a decisive nod, assuring him she would trace every lead as quickly as possible. Her composure remained flawless, completely veiling the hidden allegiance she carried beneath her professional demeanor. He instructed both of them to continue watching Renner, but warned them not to make any sudden moves. He wanted to understand exactly what the man was planning before he acted, because he could feel that the attack on the restaurant was only the opening move in a much longer game, and he had no intention of stepping into an enemy's trap simply because he had acted too quickly. Deep within him, however, a vague uneasiness continued to grow, because he knew that if Renner truly was targeting the restaurant for a reason connected to him, then the innocent young woman who spent each day cleaning its tables might soon become a piece drawn into a war she knew absolutely nothing about. That night, after Otis and Corinne had left, Emerson remained alone in the darkness of the room, and when his thoughts about Renner finally quieted, his mind drifted backward into the past, toward distant days from 30 years earlier that he had never told anyone about. The days when he was still a thin 7-year-old boy with torn shoes and a coat too light to keep him warm through a Baltimore winter. Back then, he hadn't yet carried the name Cade. He was Emerson Vale, the son of Marjorie Vale, a gentle woman whose eyes were always shadowed by sorrow and whose hands had been hardened by every kind of work she could find to support her child after her husband disappeared without a word of farewell, leaving mother and son behind in a cramped rented room with debts piling higher and hunger forever waiting at the door. There were days when they had nothing to eat, days when Marjorie went without so that her son could have her share, and Emerson still remembered with painful clarity the hollow ache in his stomach and the quiet humiliation of a child who watched other children his age sit down to hot meals while he had none. Then, one bitterly cold winter afternoon, his mother led him through the streets with the last few coins they had, not enough even to buy a loaf of bread, and the two of them stopped outside a small, warmly lit restaurant filled with the rich scent of soup, the very same restaurant, though in those days it had a different name and belonged to someone else. The owner then was an older woman with a kind face and compassionate eyes. She saw the mother and child standing close to the window, saw the longing in the little boy's eyes, and the painful embarrassment of a mother who couldn't afford to enter, and instead of driving them away as so many other places had done, she stepped outside, opened the door, and warmly invited them in, pulling out chairs for them at the table beside the window, table 7. She brought them 2 steaming bowls of soup with freshly baked bread, And when Marjorie awkwardly admitted that she didn't have enough money to pay, the owner only smiled, rested a hand on the young mother's shoulder, and said that the meal was her gift, that no one had to pay for food given from the heart, and that a person's dignity wasn't measured by the money in their pocket, but by how people treated one another in their darkest hours. The boy Emerson ate the finest soup he had ever tasted, and he never forgot the sight of his mother sitting across from him, smiling a true smile for the first time in many long days, her eyes wet not with shame, but with the relief of having been treated with kindness. In that moment, surrounded by the warmth rising from the bowl and the generosity of a stranger, the boy learned a lesson he would carry for the rest of his life, that unconditional kindness was the most powerful force in the world, stronger than money and stronger than fear. From that day forward, whenever mother and son fell into desperate circumstances, the woman who owned the restaurant quietly reached out to help them, sometimes with a meal, sometimes with a few bills pressed quickly into Marjorie's hand and a gentle reminder not to feel ashamed. It was that steady kindness that carried them through the harshest winters and planted a seed of gratitude in the boy's heart, one that continued to grow even after many years had passed. His mother died while he was still very young, before he had become capable of giving her the better life she deserved, and that regret followed him throughout the years he spent entering the underworld, changing his name from Vale to Cade to bury the poverty of his past, and building for himself a reputation that made all of Baltimore cautious, a name with no visible connection to the hungry child he had once been. Yet even after he became the most powerful man in the city, even after he possessed everything money could buy, Emerson never forgot that hot bowl of soup, or the woman who had offered it without asking for anything in return. So when, many years later, he happened to learn that the old restaurant was failing and about to be sold, he quietly paid to purchase it through several layers of intermediaries, so that no one would know who the true owner was, not to make a profit, but to preserve the place that had rescued his childhood, to protect a fragment of memory he treasured more deeply than any other possession. And now, sitting alone in the darkness as he remembered it all, Emerson began to understand that his repeated return to the restaurant, and his inability to stand by while the small young woman was mistreated, might not have come only from old memories, but also from the faint resemblance he saw in her tireless spirit and compassionate heart to the very kindness that had once saved his life. The afternoons when Emerson came by gradually became so familiar that neither he nor Delia maintained the courteous distance they had kept in the beginning. And on one rainy afternoon, when the restaurant stood completely empty, with rain tapping against the awning and mist clouding the windows, she brought him his coffee and, almost without thinking, sat down in the chair across from him instead of returning behind the counter as she usually did. For a long while, the two of them sat in silence, watching the curtain of rain spread across the street, until Delia finally spoke in a quiet voice. At first, hesitantly, then little by little, she told him about Pearl, the woman who had raised her, about waking each morning to the smell of toasted bread, about the way Pearl had taught her to treat everyone with kindness, whether they were rich or poor, and her voice caught when she spoke of the day Pearl died, leaving her alone with the restaurant, and the mountain of medical bills she was still struggling to pay month after month. She admitted that on many nights, lying in her cold apartment, she wondered whether she was strong enough to keep the place alive, whether she was failing Pearl by allowing it to sink into such hardship, and she said that when the thugs had stormed inside and begun destroying everything, what had hurt her most wasn't the fear, but the helplessness of watching what Pearl had left behind being ruined before her eyes while she could do nothing to stop it. Emerson listened in silence, without interrupting her or offering empty words of comfort. He simply watched her with calm eyes that held such profound understanding that it surprised her. And when she had finished, he quietly said that he understood what it was like to lose the person who had cared for you before you had the chance to repay them, that some debts of kindness were so heavy a lifetime would never be enough to settle them. In that moment, Delia realized there was something deeply sincere in his words, a private pain he kept hidden, and it only made her more curious about this mysterious man. She timidly asked about his family and his past, and she saw him pause for a beat, his eyes darkening slightly before he gave only a vague answer, saying that he too had once had a wonderful mother, that she had taught him the most important things in life before leaving far too soon. He stopped there and said nothing more, and Delia was perceptive enough not to press him, because she recognized that the look in his eyes when he spoke of his mother was exactly the same as the look in her own whenever she thought of Pearl. A gentle silence settled between them, a fragile closeness beginning to take shape, making Delia's heart beat faster. and she lowered her eyes to the coffee cup in her hands, too embarrassed to look up, for fear he might read everything stirring inside her, an emotion she hadn't allowed herself to feel in a very long time, something she longed for and feared at once because she knew she had nothing to offer except a wounded heart and a life burdened with hardship. Emerson, meanwhile, was fighting a fierce battle within himself, because every word she had spoken, every tear she had struggled to hold back, softened something inside him in a way that felt dangerously beyond his control. He knew better than anyone that he shouldn't allow himself to move any closer, that his world was filled with blood and darkness, that anyone he cared about could become a target for his enemies, and that sitting there beneath the warm light of the restaurant, sharing tender moments with a woman as innocent as Delia, was a selfish and dangerous indulgence he should have ended immediately. Yet he didn't stand and leave as reason told him to. He remained where he was, quietly watching her in the gray light of the rainy afternoon. And when Delia accidentally lifted her eyes and met his gaze, they both went still in a moment that seemed to stretch without end, a moment in which every word became unnecessary, leaving only the sound of rain and two hearts beating with the same uncertain rhythm. Delia was the first to look away. She rose quickly and made an excuse about bringing more coffee even though his cup was still full, her cheeks flushed and her hands trembling slightly, while Emerson closed his eyes and released a long breath, silently reproaching himself for allowing things to go this far. Deep within him, a vague resolve began to form, that he had to protect her at any cost, had to keep her far from the darkness of his world, even if doing so meant concealing his true identity and the secrets steadily growing between them, secrets he knew couldn't remain hidden forever. Everything came to light on an otherwise ordinary morning, when Franklin Voss asked Delia to go upstairs to the small office behind the restaurant and help him find the food supply contract he needed to review, and while searching through the old drawers crowded with papers, her hand accidentally brushed against a file carefully hidden inside a brown envelope at the bottom of a locked cabinet Franklin had carelessly forgotten to secure that day. At first, she had no intention of opening it, but her eyes happened to fall upon the bold words printed across the first page, the restaurant's certificate of ownership, and her heart seemed to stop when she realized that the true owner wasn't some management company, as she had believed all these years. Behind layer after layer of tangled intermediary corporations, she uncovered a confidential management agreement, linking the shell company to the head of Cade Enterprises, Emerson Cade. Delia stood frozen, the papers trembling in her hands as her mind spun, desperately trying to piece everything together. The strange man who had saved her that day, the man who kept returning to drink coffee and listen as she spoke about Pearl, the man for whom she had begun to feel something fragile but genuine, was in fact the true owner of the restaurant, the person who had held both her fate and the future of this place in the palm of his hand all along without ever saying a word. She hurriedly turned through the pages that followed, and each document felt like another blade cutting into her heart. There were records of the secret purchase made many years earlier, discreet payments that had kept the restaurant operating, and every transaction bore the trace of the same name. What wounded her most wasn't that he was wealthy or powerful, but that he had sat across from her through so many afternoons, listening as she revealed her fear of losing the restaurant, her burden of debt, and her helplessness, while knowing the entire truth and choosing to remain silent, allowing her to believe he was nothing more than a kind stranger who had happened to enter her life. The feeling of betrayal rose in her throat until she could barely breathe, mingling with shame as she remembered every moment she had exposed her weakness before him, every instant of closeness she had believed sincere, only to discover that it had all been built upon one enormous lie. She wondered whether his kindness had ever been real, or whether it had merely been a game played by a powerful man amusing himself with her small and troubled life. At that moment, the office door opened and Emerson stepped inside. He had arrived at the restaurant as usual, and Franklin had told him she was upstairs. But when he saw the documents in her hands and her pale face streaked with tears, his entire body went still, and in that instant, he understood exactly what had happened. Delia lifted her eyes to him. They were red from crying, yet her gaze was sharp and cold with pain as she asked in a trembling voice whether all of it was true, whether he really owned the restaurant. And when Emerson didn't deny it, merely giving a slight nod with regret written across his face, she felt as though the ground beneath her had collapsed. Choking on her words, she asked why he had hidden it from her, why he had allowed her to open her heart to him and trust him while he knew everything and continued pretending to be a stranger, and her voice broke as she said she had believed he was different from other men with money and power, believed he genuinely cared, but now she understood that she had only been a fool for him to pity. Emerson stepped toward her and tried to explain. He said he had reasons for keeping the truth hidden, that he had never meant to deceive her, that every act of kindness and every feeling of concern he had shown her was real. But Delia backed away from the hand he reached toward her, shaking her head fiercely as tears streamed down her face. She said she couldn't trust him anymore, that every word he spoke now seemed stained by deception in her eyes. She placed the file down hard upon the desk, slipped past him, and ran out of the office, leaving Emerson standing alone in the cramped room, feeling for the first time in many years a helplessness that was foreign to him, because he, the man whose name alone could make all of Baltimore tremble, couldn't find a single word capable of healing the wound his silence had inflicted upon the only woman who had stirred his hardened heart. And he knew that this time, all his power and all his money were utterly meaningless. While Delia was still drowning in hurt and avoiding Emerson for several days, Hollis Renner quietly moved on to the next step in his game, a move far more subtle than the brute force of the thugs who had come before, because he understood that open violence would only draw Emerson's attention, while truly strangling the restaurant required using the machinery of the law itself, all while keeping everything outwardly legitimate. One morning, just as Delia had opened the restaurant and begun her usual work, two men in inspection uniforms stepped inside, introduced themselves as officers from the city's Food Safety Authority, produced identification cards that appeared valid, and announced that the restaurant was being subjected to an unannounced inspection following a complaint about unsanitary conditions. Delia watched in disbelief as they moved through the kitchen she had always kept spotless, opening every cabinet, taking photographs, and filling page after page with notes, and in less than half an hour, they placed a thick stack of citations on the table before her, listing violation after violation she had never even heard of, from improper food storage temperatures and a drainage system that supposedly failed to meet regulations to vague offenses she knew had been invented, along with an enormous fine and a warning that unless every issue was corrected within a brutally short period of time, the restaurant would be forced to close permanently. She tried to protest, insisting that her kitchen was always clean and that the accusations were completely without foundation. But the two men replied coldly that she had the right to appeal through the proper channels, a process she knew would be so expensive and drawn out that it could ruin her before she ever had the chance to prove her innocence. After they left, Delia sank into a chair, clutching the stack of citations against her chest, feeling as though the final wall protecting her life was being broken apart piece by piece. And Franklin Voss, who had witnessed everything, approached with a tense expression, looked through the papers, then slowly shook his head and whispered that something wasn't right, that inspections like this never happened so suddenly or with such severity unless someone was pulling strings behind the scenes, and a dark suspicion began taking shape in his mind. Not long afterward, more trouble followed in a steady succession, as though every blow had been arranged in advance. Their longtime food supplier suddenly called to announce that deliveries would stop for reasons no one could clearly explain. The bank sent a letter demanding a review of the old loan Pearl had left behind, and then a local newspaper published an article suggesting that the restaurant had sanitation problems, causing several regular customers to grow uneasy and stay away. Delia felt as though she were being surrounded on every side by an invisible force whose face she couldn't see, each passing day bringing another piece of bad news, another weight pressing down upon shoulders already bent beneath too much responsibility. And in her despair, she realized these weren't random coincidences at all, but a carefully planned campaign meant to suffocate her restaurant slowly and legally, in a way that left her unable to fight back or even call for help. What she didn't know was that every one of those calculated attacks had been set in motion from Hollis Renner's office, where he sat in the darkness watching each of her reactions with the cold satisfaction of a spider waiting for its prey to entangle itself in the web, because he understood that all he had to do was drive the young woman into a corner, push the restaurant to the brink of collapse, and the person protecting it from the shadows, the man Renner truly intended to target, would be forced to reveal himself and act, giving Renner both the excuse and the opportunity to spring his trap. Meanwhile, Delia, still angry and wounded, stubbornly refused to turn to Emerson for help, even though deep inside she knew he was the only person with enough power to save her. She told herself she would solve everything on her own, that she didn't want to owe anything more to a man who had deceived her, and so she quietly went from place to place, knocking on the doors of one agency after another, and trying to file appeals that led nowhere, her slender shoulders carrying the full loneliness of a battle she had no chance of winning. But what she failed to understand was that every desperate step she took had already been anticipated by Renner, and the trap he was laying wasn't aimed only at the restaurant or at her, but at the very heart Emerson was trying so carefully to conceal, turning an innocent young woman into the perfect piece in a war between two underworld powers, a war she didn't even realize had already pulled her in. The escalation didn't end with legal pressure, and late one evening, when Wade Coleman, the kind 29-year-old assistant cook who had faithfully stood beside Delia in the kitchen for the past several years, locked the restaurant's back door and started home, 3 unfamiliar figures were already waiting for him in the dark alley behind the building, blocking his path. The next morning, when Delia arrived to open the restaurant, she was horrified to learn that Wade was in the hospital, and when she rushed to his bedside, words failed her at the sight of the swollen bruises covering the face of the coworker she had always regarded as a younger brother, his arm wrapped in a cast. Wade tried to give her a reassuring smile, but the fear in his eyes hadn't yet faded. In a hoarse voice, he told her that the men who attacked him hadn't taken anything. They had only left a cold message, saying this was the final warning, that the restaurant should close, and its owner should learn to cooperate and leave before things became worse for everyone who continued to remain there. Delia sat beside the hospital bed, gripping Wade's uninjured hand as tears streamed down her cheeks, and a fury mixed with despair, unlike anything she had ever known, rose inside her, because now the unseen enemy was no longer targeting only her or the restaurant's doors, tables, and chairs. They had harmed an innocent man, someone who had suffered simply because he worked beside her, and that guilt hurt more deeply than any blow they could have struck against her own body. She realized that she couldn't continue trying to carry everything alone, that her pride and wounded anger had become insignificant beside the safety of the people she loved, and although her heart still ached because Emerson had hidden the truth from her, she understood that he was the only person powerful enough to stop the nightmare spreading around them. But before she could go to him, news of Wade's assault reached Emerson first, and when Otis Pruitt entered his office to report what had happened, for the first time in many years, Otis saw his employer truly angry. It wasn't a loud or explosive rage, but a terrifying stillness that chilled the blood. Emerson's face hardened, as though carved from stone, and his eyes darkened with a coldness so severe that even Otis, a former soldier long accustomed to danger, felt a shiver move down his spine. Emerson rose from his chair, his voice still low and steady, but every word seemed forged from ice. He ordered Otis to mobilize their people, not to start a noisy war, but to immediately build an invisible circle of protection around the restaurant, around Delia, and around Wade in the hospital. He wanted every alleyway and every street the young woman traveled to be watched quietly by his men, and he wanted a clear message delivered to whoever stood behind this, that anyone who dared lay another finger on the people connected to that place would pay a price far greater than they could imagine. That very night, Emerson's hidden power began moving with quiet but overwhelming force. Phone calls were made, influential names were spoken, and within only a few hours, the suppliers suddenly called back to apologize and resume deliveries. The newspaper that had published the damaging article removed it without explanation, and the 2 men who had impersonated health inspectors vanished as though they had never existed. Everything happened so silently that Delia didn't even understand why the troubles surrounding her had suddenly begun to subside. She only sensed an indescribable shift in the air, as though an invisible hand had spread a shield around her, and when she happened to notice an unfamiliar man standing across the street watching the restaurant throughout the afternoon, followed by another who quietly took his place that evening, she began to understand that someone was secretly protecting her. Deep inside, she knew exactly who it was, and although the pain of his deception hadn't disappeared, a complicated emotion rose within her, part undeniable gratitude, part confusion at the realization that the man she was trying so hard to avoid was also the only one silently standing between her and the darkness closing in, and that perhaps behind his silence and deception, there was something far deeper than she had ever imagined. A few days later, after Wade had been discharged from the hospital, and the restaurant had temporarily returned to its usual rhythm beneath the quiet protection Delia had gradually come to recognize, she decided she needed to put her heart in order. One afternoon, while cleaning out the old cabinet where Pearl had once kept her familiar belongings, she discovered a cloth-bound notebook faded with age that she had somehow never noticed before. As she turned through the yellowed pages covered with recipes written in Pearl's familiar slanting hand, she suddenly stopped at one page bearing a strange illustration, a napkin folded into a triangle, and placed diagonally across a knife, with the blade facing downward at a precise angle. Beside it was a hurried note Pearl had written, words Delia had seen as a child but had never truly understood. An instruction saying that if the day ever came when she faced real danger, the kind of danger she couldn't speak about in front of those who meant her harm, she should arrange the table with this signal somewhere visible from the window, and the person who needed to know would understand. Memory came rushing back. Delia remembered the afternoons of her childhood when Pearl had patiently taught her how to fold that napkin, making her repeat the steps again and again until she knew them by heart as though it were a game, telling her that this was a secret belonging only to the two of them. A silent cry for help passed down from an old story Pearl had never finished telling. She also remembered the rare seriousness in Pearl's eyes when she warned that the signal must only be used when there was no other way out, when every other means of asking for help had been taken away. Delia had been too young then to understand its true meaning. She had regarded it only as a tender memory shared between grandmother and granddaughter. But now, sitting inside a restaurant surrounded by shadowy forces, she suddenly felt the weight of that old instruction, as though Pearl were reaching across some vast distance to place a key in her hand, though Delia still didn't know what door it was meant to open. Half unconsciously, and half driven by an instinct she couldn't name, Delia walked to table 7 beside the window that afternoon, the table Pearl had loved most, and slowly folded a napkin into a triangle before laying it diagonally across a knife, with the blade turned down. Exactly as Pearl had taught her, at the same precise angle and facing outward through the window toward the street. She didn't do it because she truly believed it would accomplish anything, but simply because it made her feel closer to Pearl while her heart was so full of uncertainty. She had no idea that on that very afternoon, Emerson had decided to stop by and quietly watch the restaurant from across the street, as he had been doing in recent days, and when his gaze casually passed over the window and came to rest on table 7, his entire body suddenly went still. For one moment, his heart seemed to stop, because the arrangement of the napkin and knife wasn't accidental. It was a signal he had seen only once in his entire life, many years ago, a sign he had believed buried with the past, and seeing it appear before him now felt like an echo from a distant time he had never spoken about to anyone. He stood frozen across the street, his eyes fixed on the triangular napkin laid diagonally across the knife, while unanswered questions crowded his mind. How did she know that signal? Who had taught it to her? And what hidden connection bound her, this restaurant, and the past he had always kept concealed? A feeling of shock and emotion rose within Emerson, difficult even for him to define, because he realized that the threads of fate were slowly being drawn tight, that his appearance at this restaurant, the feelings he had developed for this young woman, and the signal now placed before him didn't seem like separate coincidences at all, but pieces of a much larger story, one rooted deep in a past even he didn't yet fully understand, and he knew the time had come to uncover the truth hidden behind it all. Driven by the signal he had just seen, Emerson went to Franklin Voss that very evening, the only person still alive who knew about his connection to the restaurant, and demanded that he reveal everything he knew about Pearl, the former owner who had passed away, because a powerful instinct told him that Franklin had been keeping something hidden for many years. Franklin remained silent for a long while, his aged face marked by the struggle of a man carrying a secret too heavy to bear, and at last he sighed, poured himself a glass of whiskey, and began to speak, his voice lowering as though it were reaching back from a distant time. He said he had worked at the restaurant since he was a young man. Under the former owner, Emerson had always remembered with such gratitude the kind-hearted woman who had once taken in Emerson and his mother during their darkest days. And then Franklin looked directly into Emerson's eyes and revealed the truth that made his entire world sway beneath him. The compassionate woman who had given him that steaming bowl of soup and rescued his childhood all those years ago was Pearl, Delia's grandmother. Emerson went completely still, the glass in his hand suspended halfway to his lips, his mind spinning as he tried to assemble the pieces he had never realized belonged to the same picture. The gentle woman from his childhood memories, and the grandmother Delia had spoken about with tears in her voice through so many afternoons were one and the same, and the restaurant he had secretly purchased to preserve that memory was the very place her granddaughter now struggled every day to protect. Franklin continued, explaining that in those years, when Emerson and his mother had fallen into their most desperate circumstances, hunger hadn't been the only danger threatening them. A ruthless creditor had also been relentlessly pursuing Marjorie, a dangerous man willing to do anything to recover the money her vanished husband had left unpaid, and it was Pearl who had stepped forward to protect them. During the most dangerous nights, she hid mother and son in the small room behind the restaurant, and used every connection she possessed, along with her own wisdom, to mislead the creditor, saving both their lives from an ending that might have been tragic. He said Pearl and Marjorie had become close friends during those difficult days, and because they needed a way to warn one another whenever danger was near without arousing suspicion, the two women created a secret signal, a particular arrangement of a folded napkin placed diagonally across a knife beside the window. A silent message only they understood, telling one another when to hide, when it was safe, and when help was needed. As he listened, Emerson felt a chill run down his spine, because he suddenly understood the meaning of the signal he had seen on table 7 that afternoon. Pearl had passed that life-saving sign down to her granddaughter, even though Delia knew nothing of its true origin or the weight it carried, and the fact that she had arranged it there almost unconsciously that day felt like a thread of destiny joining the past of 30 years ago to the present. Emerson sat in silence for a long time, and rare tears he had believed had dried up years before began burning at the corners of his eyes, because he realized that for all these years, he had believed he purchased the restaurant only to repay a debt of gratitude to a kind stranger, when in truth, fate had arranged for him to protect the last surviving blood of the woman who had saved his life. The young woman who had quietly awakened his hardened heart was the granddaughter of the woman who had taught him his first lesson about kindness and human dignity. Franklin added that he had kept this secret for so long because Pearl had instructed him never to reveal it while she was alive. She hadn't wanted Delia to grow up beneath the burden of old debts and old conflicts. She had wanted only for her granddaughter to live a peaceful life, and she believed that if the day ever came when destiny needed to set things right, it would find its own way. Emerson rose and walked toward the window, looking out in the direction of the little restaurant now shrouded in darkness, and inside him, overwhelming emotion merged with a resolve harder than steel, because protecting Delia was no longer merely a matter of affection or compassion. It had become a sacred vow to the dead, a debt of gratitude he was willing to repay with his own life, and he knew that no matter what trap Hollis Renner might set, he would never allow Pearl's last living descendant to suffer another wound. With a renewed sense of purpose, Emerson threw himself into pursuing every lead connected to Renner with an urgency he had never shown before, and he ordered Otis Pruitt to dig deeper into the mysterious streams of money Corinne had previously claimed she couldn't trace, because the instinct of a man who had survived countless conspiracies warned him that the most dangerous truths were often hidden inside the gaps where information seemed to disappear. Otis, driven by unwavering devotion and a quiet suspicion he hadn't yet dared voice, secretly investigated along a different path without relying on the reports Corinne had provided, and after many nights spent following one lead after another, he uncovered something that left even him shaken. The money supposedly vanishing through overseas accounts hadn't vanished at all. It had been deliberately concealed by the very person entrusted with finding it. Late one night, Otis brought his discovery to Emerson and laid the evidence across the desk: records of secret meetings, cleverly disguised transactions, and trails that all pointed toward one bitter truth. Corinne Delacroix, the trusted advisor Emerson had relied upon for so many years, the woman who held nearly all his most important secrets, was a double agent secretly working for Hollis Renner. Emerson stood motionless, the initial shock quickly giving way to a terrifying calm as he began fitting every piece together. The times Corinne had reported that the money couldn't be traced, the faint hesitation in her eyes whenever Renner's name was mentioned, something he had noticed but dismissed, and the way every move he made seemed to be anticipated by his enemy. Everything now became clear, like a picture from which he had unknowingly overlooked one essential piece. He realized that Renner had been able to remain one step ahead precisely because Corinne knew so much. She was the one who had leaked information about his connection to the restaurant, the reason Renner had known exactly where to strike the only weakness in a defensive wall that had once seemed impossible to penetrate, and the betrayal of someone he had trusted so deeply caused his heart to grow colder with every passing moment. Yet instead of acting recklessly, Emerson chose silence. He warned Otis not to reveal under any circumstances that they had discovered the truth, because a traitor who had been exposed but still believed herself safe was far more useful than one confronted immediately. He began quietly planning a counterattack, deliberately allowing Corinne access to false information so she could become the very channel through which he would lead Renner into a trap of his own making. The situation, however, remained extraordinarily dangerous, because Corinne possessed too many secrets that could cause devastating damage if they reached Renner, and Emerson understood that he was walking upon a fragile line. One small mistake could bring the entire balance of power crashing down, taking with it not only his empire, but Delia's safety as well. What troubled him most was not knowing how much Corinne had already revealed, how much Renner knew about the connection between him and the young woman, and whether this betrayal had already turned Delia into a direct target in an enemy plan whose full reach he hadn't yet anticipated. While Emerson strained to contain the danger growing within his own ranks, across the city, Corinne, still believing her treachery remained undiscovered, held a secret meeting with one of Renner's men. During that meeting, she passed along one final and crucial piece of information, that Emerson Cade's true weakness, the one thing capable of bringing the most powerful man in Baltimore to his knees, wasn't money or territory, but the small young woman at the restaurant, the granddaughter of the woman who had once saved his life. When Renner heard this, a cold and calculating smile spread across his face, because now he possessed the final and most powerful card, the ace he believed would allow him to destroy his sworn enemy. He began preparing his cruelest move yet, a move aimed directly at the most precious thing Emerson was struggling to protect, one that Emerson, despite uncovering the traitor in his midst, still hadn't realized was already being set into motion. Renner moved faster than Emerson had anticipated, choosing the most dangerous moment possible. Late one evening, when Delia left the diner where she worked her second shift and began walking back to her apartment, during the brief interval when Emerson's protective detail was changing shifts, a gap that only someone with inside knowledge of the schedule could have known about, further confirming that a traitor's hand was behind it all. As Delia passed through the familiar alley, a black vehicle without license plates suddenly pulled alongside her. Several unfamiliar figures rushed out, and before she could scream or run, a cloth soaked in sedative was pressed over her nose. The world around her swayed before fading into darkness, and the final thing she managed to think of before losing consciousness was the calm face of the man she was still angry with, yet deep inside still longed to see again. When Delia awoke, she found herself inside a vast, dark, abandoned warehouse somewhere near the harbor, her hands bound to a chair, the damp smell of rusted metal surrounding her while the distant sound of seawater striking the docks echoed through the darkness. Sitting calmly across from her on another chair beneath the only dim yellow light was a middle-aged man, with a cold face and a smile that made her blood run cold. Hollis Renner himself. He watched her with the satisfaction of a man who believed victory was already his, then spoke in a measured voice, so calm it was terrifying, telling her that she didn't need to be afraid because she was merely a piece on the board, a tool he intended to use to obtain what he wanted, and that her fate now depended entirely on whether his enemy chose to obey his demands. Delia tried to remain composed despite the frantic pounding of her heart, and she asked what he could possibly want from her, a poor waitress who had nothing to offer. Renner laughed and told her she valued herself far too little, that she had no idea how precious she was in the eyes of a certain man, and that her innocent ignorance was precisely what made her the perfect hostage. Half to satisfy his own vanity, he explained that for years he had coveted the harbor district controlled by Emerson Cade, that he had waited patiently and searched for the one weakness his enemy possessed, and that at last he had found it. It was her, the granddaughter of the woman to whom Emerson owed his life, the young woman for whom that cold-hearted man had made the fatal mistake of allowing himself to feel something. Renner ordered his men to record a brief video showing Delia tied to the chair, then sent it to Emerson with a merciless message demanding that he sign over complete control of the harbor and all his business interests within 24 hours, or the young woman would disappear from the city forever. He emphasized that Emerson was to come alone, without the police and without any of his men, unless he wanted to spend the rest of his life regretting what followed. Inside the freezing warehouse, Delia sat trembling, but she fought to keep fear from overwhelming her reason. She closed her eyes and thought of Pearl, of the lessons she had taught her, that she must never allow fear to steal her dignity. And in the middle of that despair, the memory of the secret signal, the folded napkin laid diagonally across a knife, suddenly flashed through her mind like a light at the end of a tunnel. She remembered Pearl's warning that the signal was meant to call for help when there was no other way out, and although her hands were bound, her mind began racing as she searched for a way to use it. She glanced around and studied the guards, memorizing every small detail inside the warehouse. The wooden crates, a rusted nail, a scrap of cloth, anything that might allow her to leave behind a clue, a signal only someone who understood its meaning could decipher. When Emerson received Renner's video and ultimatum, he felt as though the entire world had collapsed beneath his feet. For the first time, rage and fear collided violently within the man who had always remained composed, because he understood that he was facing the cruelest choice of his life, between the empire he had spent years building and the life of the last surviving descendant of the woman who had saved him, the woman who had awakened a heart he had believed long since turned to stone. Otis Pruitt stood silently beside him, witnessing for the first time in all their years together a situation in which his employer's power and money seemed useless. He quietly asked what Emerson intended to do, and Emerson remained silent for a long time before answering in a low, rough voice that he wouldn't walk blindly into Renner's trap, that Renner wanted him alone and unarmed, so he could destroy him easily. But Emerson wasn't a man who could be driven into a corner so simply. He knew Renner was desperate to bring everything to an end, and that desperation would become his fatal weakness. But he also understood that he had to move with extraordinary care, because even the smallest mistake could cost Delia her life. Inside his mind, a reckless yet carefully calculated plan slowly began to take shape, as he silently vowed that if Renner intended to turn the most sacred debt of gratitude in Emerson's life into a weapon, he would soon discover that a man fighting for what he cherished most was 1,000 times more dangerous than one fighting only for ambition. Inside the dark warehouse, Delia waited patiently for her chance, and when the only guard left in the room grew careless and stepped outside to light a cigarette, she acted at once. Although both wrists were bound so tightly to the chair that dark bruises had formed beneath the rope, she twisted and strained, using her numb fingertips to search blindly for anything within reach. She remembered Pearl's words from years ago, that the signal didn't necessarily have to be made with a napkin and a knife, that its true meaning lay in the shape itself. One object placed diagonally across another at that exact angle, a silent message only someone who had been taught could understand, and Delia knew that this was the moment when that seemingly useless knowledge might save her life. With extraordinary effort, she managed to reach a rusted piece of metal lying beneath the chair, and a length of old rope discarded nearby. She patiently used the toe of her shoe to drag them closer, then, with clumsy but determined movements, arranged them into the precise form of the distress signal beneath the chair, hidden from the guard's view. Placing the strip of metal diagonally across the rope at the angle Pearl had carved into her memory when she was a child, she also carefully scratched a faint version of the same symbol into the dusty concrete floor, praying that if Emerson's people ever reached this place, they would understand that she had been there and was still alive. At the same time, she left a vague indication of the direction in which her captors might take her next, because from fragments of conversation she had overheard, she had begun to suspect that they were preparing to move her to another location before Emerson's appointed meeting. Meanwhile, Emerson hadn't remained idle for a single moment. As soon as he received the ultimatum, he mobilized the vast network he had built over many years, his eyes and ears scattered through every corner of Baltimore, from dock workers and nighttime taxi drivers to nameless people living in the shadows who owed him favors. Every one of them was ordered to search for any trace of a black vehicle without license plates in any suspicious warehouse near the harbor. He also instructed Otis to quietly follow Corinne, because he knew the traitor had to be connected to the place where Delia was being held. And sure enough, Corinne's hurried phone calls unintentionally exposed a general area, narrowing the search to several abandoned warehouses along the eastern edge of the harbor. When Emerson's men silently entered and searched the first warehouse on the list, one of them, having been carefully warned to watch for a particular sign, discovered the strange arrangement beneath a chair, along with the faint scratches on the concrete floor. Though he didn't understand what it meant, he photographed it and sent the image to Emerson immediately. The moment Emerson saw the picture, his heart tightened and then broke open with an emotion he couldn't describe, because he recognized Pearl's secret signal at once, the distress sign Delia had used, and it not only confirmed that she had been held there, but also told him she was still alive, still conscious, and brave enough to fight for herself even while trapped in the hands of her enemies. He stood motionless for several seconds, overwhelmed by the realization that the thread of fate Pearl had set in motion 30 years earlier was now truly saving her granddaughter, that the lessons and love of that kind-hearted woman were still reaching across time to protect those she had cherished. And in that moment, Emerson's resolve became harder than ever before. But he also understood that Delia was no longer in that warehouse. Her captors had already moved her, and time was slipping away with every passing minute before the cruel deadline. So he had to act quickly without losing the clarity needed to avoid Renner's trap. Using the vague direction Delia had left behind and the information gathered by his network, Emerson narrowed the likely final exchange site to a larger warehouse hidden deep inside the abandoned harbor district, and he began putting a carefully constructed plan into motion. On the surface, he would pretend to accept Renner's demands so the man would feel secure, while in secret, Emerson's people would surround the area from a distance. He called Otis and gave him every instruction in a low, steady voice that carried a cold and unshakable force, then turned his eyes toward the harbor beneath the darkness and silently spoke to Delia, though she couldn't hear him, asking her to hold on a little longer, telling her that he was coming, and that this time, he wouldn't allow anyone or anything to take her away from him ever again. At the appointed hour, Emerson entered the vast warehouse deep inside the abandoned harbor district alone, carrying the leather case containing the transfer documents Renner had demanded, his stride unnervingly calm, revealing neither fear nor urgency, even though his heart was pounding inside his chest at the sight of Delia tied in the corner beneath the sickly yellow light. Hollis Renner stood waiting in the center of the warehouse with a triumphant smile, surrounded by several alert men gripping their weapons, and he welcomed his enemy with arrogant satisfaction, saying that at last the most powerful man in Baltimore had been forced to bow and surrender because of one small young woman, that he had never imagined Emerson's weakness would be so ordinary and so easy to exploit. Emerson didn't respond to the provocation. His eyes passed over Delia for only a second, long enough to make certain she was still safe. Then he placed the case on the concrete floor and spoke in a low, steady voice, saying that he had brought what Renner wanted, but before he handed it over, Renner would have to release the young woman, because that was a condition that couldn't be negotiated. Renner laughed loudly and said Emerson was in no position to make demands, that the girl would only be released after the documents were in his hands and confirmed to be valid, then motioned for one of his men to inspect the case. Emerson still didn't flinch. Instead, he slowly asked a question that stopped the smile on Renner's lips, whether he had ever wondered why every move he had made had gone so smoothly, whether he had ever considered that such ease might be the most suspicious thing of all. The air inside the warehouse suddenly seemed to harden. Renner frowned and demanded to know what Emerson was implying, and Emerson calmly replied that a man who placed too much faith in his spy often forgot that the same piece could be turned against him, that every piece of information Corinne had passed along during the final days had been something Emerson deliberately allowed her to see, carefully arranged to lead Renner to this exact place at this exact time. The color drained from Renner's face as he began to sense that something was terribly wrong, but it was already too late, because in that instant, powerful beams of light flared from every direction inside the dark warehouse, and firm voices rang out, ordering everyone to remain still, because the police had surrounded the entire area. A stern-faced middle-aged man with sharp eyes stepped from the shadows. He was Detective Roy Ashland, a veteran officer who had spent many years pursuing criminal networks throughout Baltimore. And what shocked Renner most was the slight nod Ashland gave Emerson, the quiet acknowledgement of an arrangement made long before that night. Renner shouted that it was a trap, that Emerson had joined forces with the police, something almost impossible to believe of a man who ruled the underworld, and only then did Emerson reveal the deepest part of his plan. He said that while pretending to accept Renner's demands, he had been secretly cooperating with Detective Ashland, providing all the evidence of Renner's crimes, in exchange for Delia's safety, and a way for Emerson himself to escape the darkness of his past. Emerson had calculated everything. He understood that if he confronted Renner with violence, even victory would bring endless bloodshed and would never truly end the cycle of vengeance. So he had chosen another path, one more intelligent and more humane, using the law itself to bring his enemy down and transforming a confrontation that seemed destined to end in blood into a battle of minds he had already positioned himself to win. Renner and his men were quickly subdued without a single bloody exchange of gunfire, because Emerson had arranged for everything to unfold as cleanly as possible, and his highest priority had always been the complete safety of Delia, still bound in the corner. The moment the weapons hit the floor, he rushed to her side, while Ashland's officers read out the arrest charges and placed handcuffs on Renner as he screamed in helpless fury. Emerson knelt beside Delia, and his hands that had always seemed so cold and steady, trembled as he loosened the ropes around her bruised wrists. When their eyes met, every grievance, every misunderstanding, and every wound between them seemed to dissolve in a single instant, leaving only overwhelming relief and something deeper that neither of them needed to put into words. There in the cold warehouse now flooded with light and filled with the footsteps of justice. In the days following the night at the harbor, all of Baltimore was shaken by the news of Hollis Renner's downfall, because the massive file Emerson had quietly compiled over many months and handed over to Detective Roy Ashland exposed the entire criminal empire Renner had worked so carefully to conceal From extortion networks and money laundering through overseas accounts, to bribing officials and arranging fraudulent legal inspections designed to strangle the businesses he intended to seize. The evidence was so detailed and impossible to deny that prosecutors quickly built a formidable case. Renner's assets were frozen, his network collapsed within only a few days, and he himself faced a long list of serious charges that could keep him behind bars for the rest of his life. An ending he had never imagined for a man who had always believed himself beyond the reach of the law. Trevor Bishop, the thug who had once brazenly destroyed the restaurant, quickly recognized the hopelessness of his situation after his arrest, and in exchange for a lighter sentence, he revealed everything he knew, confirming every detail of Renner's role in the attacks and the payments he had received to carry out those filthy assignments. His testimony became an important link that further strengthened an indictment already heavy with evidence. Corinne Delacroix, the traitor who had betrayed Emerson's trust, didn't escape the consequences of her actions either. When Renner's network collapsed, her role as a double agent was exposed before the law, and she was arrested on charges connected to assisting a criminal organization and committing acts of betrayal, losing the career and reputation she had spent years building and paying a devastating price for the greed that had driven her to sell her loyalty. What was most remarkable was that throughout the entire process, Emerson didn't resort to violence or the bloody revenge so common in the underworld. He chose instead to allow justice to be carried out through the legal system, a decision that surprised many people in his world, but reflected the profound change taking place within him, because he understood that only this path could truly end the cycle of hatred and bring lasting peace to those he loved. Meanwhile, after her rescue, Delia was taken to the hospital for examination and was fortunate not to have suffered any serious physical injuries, though what she had endured still left deep tremors within her, and throughout the days of her recovery, Emerson remained constantly by her side, quietly caring for her without asking for anything in return, wanting only for her to feel safe again. When Delia had finally regained enough peace of mind, Emerson sat beside her and told her every truth he had kept hidden for so long. He confessed his true identity, spoke of the underworld to which he belonged, and most importantly, told her about the extraordinary connection between their two families, how Pearl had been the compassionate woman who saved him and his mother from the poverty and desperation of their lives 30 years earlier, and how he had carried that debt of gratitude silently within him ever since. He explained that he had purchased the restaurant without any hidden motive, only to preserve the place that had once saved his life, and that he had concealed his identity not because he wanted to deceive her, but because he feared the darkness of his world would stain the innocence of hers. He sincerely apologized for allowing that silence to wound her, his voice catching as he admitted that he had been wrong not to trust her enough to reveal the truth sooner. Delia listened without speaking, tears streaming down her cheeks as she slowly came to understand the whole story, understanding that the grandmother she had loved so dearly was still protecting her even in death through the thread of fate connecting the past to the present, and that the kindness Pearl had planted so many years ago had finally returned to protect her own flesh and blood. She looked at Emerson, the man the entire city regarded as powerful and terrifying, yet who carried in his heart such a tender debt of gratitude, and in that moment, the last of her anger and pain finally dissolved. She gently reached for his hand, a gesture of forgiveness that needed no words, and the two of them fell silent together within a new and profound understanding. They knew there was still much to repair, and a long road ahead before their old wounds could fully heal. But for the first time, after everything they had endured, both Delia and Emerson felt a warm flicker of hope for a future in which they would no longer have to live in fear or hide the truth, a future built upon honesty, gratitude, and a sincere love that had survived the cruelest trials imaginable. Many months later, when spring returned to Baltimore, the little restaurant reopened with a new appearance. The windows that had once been shattered were replaced with clear panes that sparkled beneath the sunlight. The tables and chairs were carefully restored while preserving their familiar warmth, and the fragrance of toasted bread and steaming soup once again drifted through the dining room just as it had when Pearl was still alive. Delia stood in the middle of the busy restaurant as familiar customers returned, her face glowing with a simple happiness she hadn't known in a very long time, because the burden of debt had finally been lifted. The people who had threatened her had been brought to justice, and most importantly, the last home Pearl had left behind hadn't merely been preserved, but had returned to life more strongly than ever before. After everything they had endured, Emerson began slowly stepping away from the underworld he had once ruled. He gradually transferred his legitimate businesses to people he trusted and severed every remaining tie to the darkness of his past, choosing a quieter life, the kind of life his mother and Pearl surely would have smiled to see. He was often present at the restaurant now, no longer the mysterious stranger sitting silently beside the window, but the man who always stood beside Delia, helping her build a future founded upon honesty and understanding. The affection between them, after surviving so many misunderstandings, wounds, and merciless trials, blossomed into a love both deep and enduring. In one another, they found the peace they had both longed for through so many years. Delia learned to trust and open her heart again, while Emerson rediscovered the gentle part of his humanity he had believed lost during the long years he had spent in darkness. One afternoon, after the restaurant hired a new young waitress, an orphaned girl from a difficult background in whom Delia saw a reflection of her younger self, Delia led her to table 7 and patiently taught her how to fold the napkin and place it diagonally across the knife at the precise secret angle, passing down the silent distress signal Pearl had once taught her, so that it could continue to be preserved and shared through generations like an unbroken thread of love. On the wall beside table 7, directly beneath Pearl's old photograph, now protected inside a new glass frame, there hung another small frame containing the very napkin folded into that secret symbol, a quiet reminder of kindness, dignity, and debts of gratitude repaid with the whole heart. Whenever someone asked what it meant, Delia only smiled and said it was the story of a compassionate woman who had taught an entire family what it truly meant to love another human being. Delia and Emerson's story came to a warm and hopeful ending, one in which kindness was repaid, justice defeated, evil not through violence but through wisdom and integrity, and sincere love healed the deepest wounds, leaving each of us with a profound lesson that no matter where life may carry us, whether we are rich or poor, powerful or seemingly insignificant, kindness and the way we treat one another with compassion remain the most precious treasures of all, possessing the power to endure through time and transform even lives that seem beyond hope. Their story reminds us that every act of kindness, no matter how small, can plant a seed of goodness that may continue to flower and bear fruit many years later, that a person's dignity isn't found in status or wealth, but in a heart capable of valuing and respecting others, and that it's never too late for someone to return to the most decent and compassionate part of their own soul. If this story touched your heart, please subscribe to our channel, press the like button, and share this video so you can hear many more meaningful and captivating stories every day. We would also love to know how this story made you feel, and whether it reminded you of anything from your own real life. So please leave a comment and share the feelings held deep within your heart, allowing all of us to listen to and understand one another more fully. Thank you for taking the time to stay with this story until the very final moment. We wish everyone watching this video lasting good health, joy in each passing day, and a peaceful, tranquil heart. Goodbye for now, and we look forward to meeting you again in the stories to come.